sounds fine. Everything's all right and we're rolling.
Good. Dr. Wager, we'd like to thank you for being a part of our project today, not only for students here at Florida State, but students all across the country today and tomorrow. We'll get to learn a little bit about you and your life and your contributions you've made, so we appreciate your spending your time being with us today.
Perfectly welcome.
So, tell us, to start with, tell us a little bit about your journey, how you got, where you started and how you got to where you are now.
Okay. It's a long road, a windy road. Well, originally I was going to be a teacher, a high school teacher, and I started off in the area of industrial arts, which most people know as shop. And my undergraduate degree is from State University of New York in Oswego, and my undergraduate majors were electronics and graphic arts, and I went off to teach high school at the tender age of 21, and where some of my students were actually almost as old as I was, and decided that there had to be a better way to make a living. So one of my interests in college and working through college was photography, and I had worked with Don Ely actually in a summer institute to train teachers how to use cameras in improving instruction. And Don told me about this program at Indiana University. It had a master's degree, and it was called Audiovisual Education. So I wrote to Indiana University, got into their master's degree program in audiovisual education, and a year later I had that, and got my first job as an audiovisual production person at Eastern Michigan University. There we set up a production center and we help faculty create slides, make movies, generally produce local production instructional materials. My second year at Eastern Michigan University, I was asked to become the director of the campus services department, which was more like audiovisual services for the whole university. And so I agreed to do that with a corresponding salary increase, and became the manager of equipment and film showings in classrooms and things like that. And at the same time, at that point, I saw that we could use the computer to facilitate booking and management of that whole service. So I wrote some programs and created a film booking system for the university. The next year I was asked to be director of the audiovisual services at Eastern Michigan University. The director actually went back and took the job that I had in production. He was tired of directing. So with a corresponding salary increase, I took the job as director. And at that point, I was also teaching some undergraduate audiovisual production classes for Eastern Michigan University and in-service classes for Wayne State University in Taylor, Michigan, which was halfway between Detroit and Ypsilanti. I saw that with a master's degree, I wasn't going to go very far in higher education. So at that time, Indiana University was advertising a fellowship for people who wanted to go and become faculty in higher ed, some of the higher educational technology community colleges. And I applied for that, got the fellowship, and was off to Indiana to get a PhD in educational technology, which was a brand new program then. Before that, it was called Audiovisual Research. And the research program at Indiana was kind of melded with this new emphasis in production of materials to create an instructional systems program. And so I and 10 others in that fellowship program went through that and got our degrees and were ready to leave Indiana University and go to a community college and do great things. But there weren't any positions at community colleges. So I applied at Florida State for a position in the Department of Instructional Research and Services. It was called DEERS at that time. And I applied at Houston University of Texas at Houston, interviewed both places, and was offered a job at neither. However, after being coming back to Indiana and finishing up some things in my dissertation, I got a call from Florida State that said they would like me to come back and consider a position in the higher education department, teaching courses on college teaching. So I came back and looked at the job and took it. They offered it to me on the spot, and I said, yeah, I'll do that. So very presumptuous as I was off to teach college teachers how to teach college, and had never done it myself directly, except for teaching a few undergraduate courses. But very much applied my instructional systems skills to designing units of instruction, and we were on quarter hours at that point. So a course was only 10 weeks long. And that whole program was where I started. During that time, a position became available in the Educational Research Department. I'm not sure if it was called that at the time, but that was the department with Les Briggs and Robert Gagne and Walter Dick and Paul Merrill, Bobby Brown, and Tennyson, Robert Tennyson, a number of other people. And I applied for that position. It was more like an internal transfer because it was more in line with my Indiana University training. And worked with Les Briggs for a while. I was offered the position, I took it, and co-taught with Les Briggs. He was my mentor, if you want to talk about mentors. I'm doing all the talking. And co-taught the advanced development course with him. And at the time, we were using the original edition of Principles of Instructional Design that he and Gagne had written. The original book was a nice, condensed little orange-covered book that I thought brought together all the things in theory and in practice that we needed. The only problem was that it was more theory than practice. So I was invited to help rewrite that book in the second edition, and we added a number of things like instructional curriculum mapping, some other technologies, as I recall, that made it more applied. And Briggs and I wrote a handbook of procedures for the design of instruction about 1982, I guess that was, that was subsequently published.
You mentioned Briggs as being one of your mentors. Tell us a little bit about your mentors.
Well, the way to define the term, I guess, would be those people whom you work with that have an influence on what you do. So, as I said, Dr. Morgan was so kind as to let me teach along with Dr. Briggs for a while. And during that time, of course, I'd been at Florida State for 5 years, in teaching in the higher education department. So I had other mentors, too, in that department, people that I had worked with from whom I learned a lot. But in instructional systems, working with Briggs, I think what was interesting about him was that he was very much a futurist. You think of these people came out of Human Resources Lab, the Army Human Resources Lab, and their training basically was in behavioral psychology because that was the psychology of the day. But they knew that wasn't sufficient for what we were doing with instructional materials. And Briggs had worked with other people like Norm Pressey. Can't think of Pressey's first name. Pressey, Norm Crowder, and some of the other biggies in programmed instruction, and was very much interested in some of the newer technologies and how media affected the design of instruction. So we had many long discussions about, where media fit in, and what the role of media was in learning, and what the role of media was in instruction, and how that fit into instructional design. And I think that was a large part of my orientation. I know it was because even today I go back to those roots when I think about, how is an intervention going to improve learning? And I can go back to those roots and those original discussions and very vividly hear him hear his voice talking to me about that. Corny.
Tell us a little bit about what it was like to go to Indiana University.
Well, Indiana University is a beautiful university. But at the time, that the instructional systems program was brand new, so it was kind of roll your own, you know. You had some faculty, there were basically three emphases: learning environments design, learning theory, and materials design. I would put it that way. And we played around with all three, you know, try to figure out where we fit and what we wanted to do and how we'd make an impact on the field. And during that time, Tom Schwinn was one of my advisors. One of my close friends and advisors was Lawson Hughes, who's an educational psychologist. Ivor Davies came to the university about that time. Robert Hynek was there. James Knowlton, Harvey Black were my instructors. So a lot of psychology. All of them were psychologists and statistician type research people.
You talked about helping put out the second editions of Principles of Learning. You've also written quite a few articles and other books. Can you tell us a little bit about the process you use for research and writing articles and books?
Process for writing, jeez. Whew. Well, I guess it starts with an opinion or an idea of how to do something, in my case, and then just getting it down on paper and trying to explicate it and make it as clear as I possibly can for other readers. It's a painful process. It's hard. It's something that once you get into, it's not that bad, but you have to keep at it, and there's so many other competing things for your time. It's a very time-consuming process for me, writing is. I like to solve things at high level. I don't like detail particularly. I like the high-level design and leave the detail to somebody else. But writing is a lot of detail, and so that's what makes it hard for me. But I don't know that I have a particular process. I just have to force myself to sit down and do it.
What excites you about our field today?
Probably change, and I agree with some other people that have said that, you know, we discover the past all over again every day. But there's a lot of things that I've studied in the past that I see coming back again today to be reconsidered as viable theories or viable ways of approaching things. And I was interested in them then, things like Carl Rogers' freedom to learn and what Carl Rogers had to say to us. At the same time, I could see some of the weaknesses in the technology or the systematic part of that. You know, how do you apply that in a way that's replicable? How do you make it work? How do you know how it's working? What's I think exciting today is a reconsideration of some of those earlier ideas, the change in the technologies that afford new capabilities. I've always been interested in the technology and how things work. So when you can give those technologies to people that they can do it themselves and help them learn how to use them to make new tools, I think that's very exciting. Just getting people interested in some of the questions about how you can improve learning, I think, is exciting.
You've in the years that you've been here, surely you have some stories, some favorite stories about our field that you'd like to share with us.
Some of my favorite stories with regard to instructional systems design were instructional design projects I was on myself. Early in the mid-'70s, I was doing a lot of military instruction along with private contracting and as a consultant, and I was learning a lot at the same time. But we had a large contract LSI had a large, which was then not LSI, I forget what it was, but the university had a contract to develop military instruction for the Army Signal School at Fort Gordon in Georgia. And so I think the technology we were using was something called a Bessler QC, which was a 8mm film strip with a synchronized audio tape. That's how high tech it was. At any rate, some of the topics that we designed for, where one was how to raise a radio antenna. Now, a radio antenna is about an 80-foot long or 100-foot long pole, and you attach some wires to, you put it all together at telescopes, and you put the pieces together, and you attach some wires to it, and you anchor some wires, and you pull it up. So our subject matter experts at the time were basically technical manuals. You know, we looked at technical manuals, we saw how the technical manuals told you to do the task, and then we wrote more complete and illustrated instruction on how to do the task. So, and before we put it on the Bessler QC, we basically field tested and did our formative evaluation on storyboards. So we had written this instruction for how to raise the radio antenna, and we took it out in the field for field testing and met the platoon of people that were supposed to test this instruction, and it was 4 women. Not big women either, 4 women. Well, these antennas are not light, but that's what we were given to work with as our field test group, and they read the instruction, they understood it completely, and they set about to put this antenna up. And they anchored it, and following the instruction, 1 or 2 of them walked the pole up, and while the other one pulled on the wire, and it got about halfway up and decided it wasn't going any further. And these women were holding there like this, and as the pole came down, they were sliding along. It was just like a tug-of-war contest until all at once says, 4, and they let go of the thing, and it went crashing to the ground. So I learned something from that. I learned that you have to consider a lot more in instructional design. You know, who's your target audience? There was another one that we designed for, and that was how to calculate the length of a radio antenna. Once they get the poles up, there's a wire that runs between the poles, and that wire has to be a certain length in order to broadcast on a certain frequency. So there's this formula, that mathematical formula that you can work out to know how long to pull the wire out, measure it, and cut it off, and then you attach it to the pole, and you can broadcast at a certain frequency. So we designed the instruction to teach people how to calculate the length of this antenna wire, and we took it out in the field to evaluate it. And we went out with the radios and the wire and everything else. No women out there this time, wouldn't have made any difference. But we got out there and we said, okay, we want to broadcast on a 20-meter band. How would you calculate the length of this wire? The guy goes around to the back of the radio and pulls out a measuring tape, and he puts the measuring tape on the wire, runs the tape out, and cuts the wire. I thought, they sent us somebody that already knows the formula. I mean, how can we test the instruction? I said, well, explain to me how you did that. He said, well, this here ruler's measured out in frequency. You want 20 meters, you pull it out to 20 meters, and you cut the wire. I thought, well, yeah, probably somebody had a $500,000 contract to produce that ruler, so they wouldn't have to calculate the length of the wire. And from that, I learned, well, you better know your materials you're working with much better than we did, because we were teaching something that was totally unnecessary. I said, well, what if you didn't have that tape in the back of your radio? And then we couldn't measure that wire, could we? Point made. The third story I have is, again, a military story, and it was the reconnaissance, the recovery of a mired vehicle. A mired vehicle is a tank or some other vehicle that gets stuck in the mud. And what we were to do was to teach him how to calculate what kinds of pulleys and what kind of pulley setups they would need, and the pulling force on pulleys of multiple wheel pulleys in order to be able to pull a tank out of the mud. And so we should have learned by now, I guess. We could have gone out and said, well, how do you do this task? But we didn't. We looked at the manual and the technical manuals, and we designed our instruction, went out in the field, and we had all these pulleys and asked them to figure out how they would pull that tank out of the mud. And he said, well, I get on my radio and call in every other big machinery around here, and we hook it up and pull that sucker out. So again, you got to consider the context, I guess, in terms of your instructional design. There's three of the stories. Another one, we were in basic skills training, looking at basic skills training, which involves reading and writing. And a number of people that come into the military are not native English speakers, so they go through English-speaking classes. And we wanted to go, we visited, this was Fort Benning, Georgia, visit one of the English as a second language class. So we went up there, and they were practicing vocabulary. And they were doing things like boots. And they'd hold up a boot, boots, and the class would say boots. And the word boots would be on the screen. And then they would say something like backpack. And the whole class would go backpack. And the words would be on the screen. And what was funny was the next word that came up, mildew. The whole group says, mildew. And there was no way to show mildew on the screen, but I'm sure it's a very important skill for a Southern soldier.
Goodness.
Would you define in your own words and thoughts what instructional systems is?
Instructional systems? It's the application of theory, common sense, and technologies to the design of learning environments and learning materials. That's my definition.
You have your background is in, did a lot of work with audio-visual.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of folks in our field have a background in psychology. You've talked about the importance of psychology as far as a foundation. Today in our field, we see a lot of folks that don't have that background coming into our field. How important is it to have that background?
Well, it's helped me. My undergraduate minors were personnel and organizational behavior in business and educational psychology. So I think it's given me the foundation for evaluating and constructing theory. Without that, I think I would, I wouldn't have a good foundation or basis for making some of the decisions that I make. So it helped me. Otherwise, it maybe just become too much a technician and not enough thought behind what it is you're doing as a technician.
You've been a person who is well known as being an expert with technology, especially with computers, and you've tell us a little bit about the importance of technology in instructional systems today.
I think it's important to think of technology very broadly. Both things like cognitive technology, which are the means and the methods, for looking at some of the types of things like collaborative learning, cooperative learning, self-directed learning, and hard technology, and as tools for the presentation of stimuli, the elicitation of interaction, the providing for practice and things like that. So technology are kind of the tools and methods of our trade. It would be like, what's the importance of wrenches for a mechanic? You can't do mechanics work without your tools. So I think there are new tools coming along all the time, but they're probably just elaborations of older tools. And I think it's the same thing with mechanics. You know, they have newer tools and special tools all the time. So technology is just a part of our toolkit to do our job. I see it as inseparable from our job.
There's a lot of excitement about the web, the World Wide Web.
Mhm.
Tell us where does the World Wide Web fit in instructional systems today? What do you think about it?
Well, if you go back to my previous story about the Bessler QC, which was an animated, a synchronized film strip, basically, you can see that the web is another technology. That was a technology then. It was pretty hot stuff, I guess. The web is a technology today, and people think it's pretty hot stuff. But it's an extension or a continuation of other technologies. So in the web, you have telephone technology, or the ability to talk back and forth to people. You have teletype technology embedded in the web, where you can communicate with type back and forth to people. And you have delivery technologies that include television, sound, other media, all embedded in this one media. So it's just a more complete package for the delivery of the stimuli and the elicitation of the responses than we have in many of the other more primitive media, perhaps. The term today, a lot of people are using convergence technology. They're talking in terms of convergence of television as a broadcast media and the web, the interactivity of the web. But it's just an extension of the web, it seems to me. So the excitement is in the capabilities that it affords you as a designer to include into your instructional materials, your instructional environment.
Distance learning, distance education is a real hot issue in education. Tell us about your thoughts on distance education. You're doing and a little bit about the project that you're working on here currently.
My thoughts on distance education? I've never seen distance education as a great big deal. The Army-wide training systems back in the 70s were distance education. Correspondence courses are distance education. I think the capabilities of the technology make it a much more viable format or means for teaching and learning, in that it provides more capabilities for the student. The typical problem with distance education was boredom and dropout, and also probably to some extent quality control. Knowing whether or not the person out there was really performing at the same level as the campus person or the locally taught person. And I think the web and some of the new technologies aid in taking care of some of those problems. I think anytime you can increase the access of education to people, you performed a service. So I think it's a valuable thing to do. But technologically, it's no different from teaching somebody on campus or next door.
Tell us about your project you're working on.
The Open University project. Well, we're designing a program, a master's degree program for people who wish to go into the field of open and distance learning. And that program includes coursework or formal instruction, in this case distance instruction, using the internet, and studying things like the history and philosophy of distance learning and open learning, open education systems, educational psychology and theory, learning theory, the design of instructional materials and materials to be used in distance learning, and the evaluation and research in distance learning programs. So we're in the process of creating courses and the infrastructure for delivering that particular system. I don't know what else to say about it.
And I guess one of the notable things about it, if you'll comment, is the partnership and relationship with another country on this.
Yeah, the British Open University has been in distance education probably longer, as far at university level distance education, longer than anybody else, giving formal university degrees. So by partnership, we hope to learn from their experience. Also, they were developing a master's degree in open and distance learning at the same time we were considering it. So the thought was, by collaborating, we could use some of their materials, they could use some of our materials, and we could collaborate in a design effort to produce this program, and in fact that's what's happened. So a good deal of the material in our program was designed by the British Open University, and some of the material is locally designed that they have, that they're free to use too in their program.
Technology has one of the tools that instructional systems designers are using with technology is our development of electronic performance support systems. Tell us a little bit about what that is and why is that important?
If one of the purposes of our field is not strictly education for education's sake, or liberal arts education, if it's technical education or performance education, what we're trying to do is to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of the workforce. And we know that training isn't the only way to do that. There are other aids, you might call them job aids, incentives, other ways of improving human performance. So if we think about performance technology as a broad umbrella, then instructional technology is one part of that performance technology umbrella, that is, teaching people how to do a task. Other parts are helping them do the task by engineering tools to help them do the task, or by re-engineering their work so that the workflow goes better, or re-engineering the incentive system. And all these things work together. So electronic performance support systems is simply using the computer to provide information and or training and or processing power to the person that's doing a task that requires the use of information, or where information provides added value. So what we're doing at Florida State is designing performance technology emphasis in our instructional systems program, where people can look at other solutions and how the design process fits into consideration of these other solutions, such as the design of electronic databases and performance support tools. So that's my interest. It's still just an extension of technology, an extension of using tools to help people do what they have to do.
Tell us a little bit about an exciting thing that you have been working on that involves the web and instructional systems, and that's Construe. Tell us a little bit about what Construe is, what's it intended to do, and how the whole thing came about.
Oh, okay. Well, a few years ago, Marcy Driscoll, our esteemed leader now and department head, left the university and went to Arizona State University to be a professor over there. And so I was tasked or challenged to teach the alternate views of instruction course, which is anything else other than Gagne and Briggs, basically. And I chose to do this, and at the same time I had a graduate student, David LeBeau, who was interested in helping me do this because he thought he had a better way to do it. And one of the thoughts we had was to try to model and teach that course using an alternate view of instruction. So we tried to model some of the theories that we were teaching in that course, theories like constructivism and social intercourse and discourse and whatnot, and teach that, to employ that theory in the design of an instructional learning environment. So we created some electronic tools, little databases, that allowed people to work with ideas and to share ideas. Actually, we used HyperCard. And something called Alt Views, a little database came out where you could link concepts to readings and share that with other people and whatnot. As time progressed, we got a chance to, the dean got some money from the Board of Regents to teach a distance course to community college instructors. And the purpose of that grant was to investigate different ways of doing distance education. One was two-way television, interactive television. One was more conventional videotape, mail them out, hold teleconferences. And ours was to use the internet. And so we set about to take and put the system we developed for Alt Views onto the internet. And we set up a little Mac server and started some web pages, but we saw immediately that we weren't going to get the kind of interactivity, and we didn't know enough about internet and databases in order to make Alt Views work. So I had some contact with NCR Corporation, and NCR Corporation had been talking about collaborating with universities on some project, research project. So I went up to Dayton, Ohio, and I said, you know, it's time to put up or shut up. And that wasn't exactly put that way. But we convinced NCR Corporation, who was a part of AT&T at the time, to help us in this effort to design a web-based system that would be highly interactive and that would employ an alternate view or alternate theories, or enable the instructor to use alternate theories of instruction over the web. A constructivist community of learners, if you will, via Scartameli and Bayreuther. Community of learners approach on the web. There's a very talented programmer in Seattle, Washington that helped put the system together, and David LeBeau worked on it that semester. And we put together a system basically taught 110 people all over Florida, community college instructors, Alt Views, using the web. And that system now we use in a lot of our courses. It's a very flexible, very useful piece of software.
Tell us, I guess, elaborate a little more on specifically what the student does when they're using Construe.
Construe is nothing more than a shell with some capabilities in it. What a student does depends on what the instructor wants them to do. In our system, basically we took the philosophy that any discipline is based on its concepts, the application of its concepts and principles. So we tried to define what those concepts were. The other principle of it was that the concepts and principles are reflected in the readings of the field. So we tried to pull together the primary readings of the field, that the major players, the things major players are writing, and ask the students to define the concepts from the context of those writings. And then gave students a project basically that caused them to apply those principles as they saw it to solving a problem. I think it's a strategy that can be used in almost any subject, but it is an alternate instructional learning environment strategy from typical materials-based didactic or direct instruction.
How important is it new students coming into graduate programs and instructional systems to have to know technology? How much should they know when they're wanting to come into our program?
Probably the less the better. Technology changes so fast that what you have to learn about technology is how to deal with the change. And I think I say that a little bit quickly. There are some basic foundation things that I learned back in undergraduate electronics that stick with us today. That it helped me to design and build my own computer, to know how operating systems work and to work at some of those more detailed levels. But probably designers need to think about what their strengths and what their interests are, and not everybody needs a hardware level knowledge of technology. Some people can work at that level and some people can't. So if people come into our field from a number of different fields, if you come in with a technology background, like from computing science, you're obviously going to have that level in that direction of orientation. If you come in from the social sciences, you're going to have a different orientation. Or if you come in from business, you're going to have a different orientation. And it's not important, I don't think, that everybody have the same orientation, because you're going to be working in teams with other people, and that knowledge and skill will come out when it's needed. I think it's good to have an awareness level of who those people are and what they know and what they can bring to the table, rather than thinking you can do everything yourself. I long ago decided that I was not a programmer, and that programmers could do amazing things that I couldn't do. Although I dabble in programming, I know my limitations. So if we're on a large project that calls for the design of new databases or CGI interfaces to the web, I'm not going to be the person that programs them. But I will be the person that works with the programmer to tell them what I need the programs to do. And I think you have to decide what level you want to work at, and at least know where to go.
What are the to continue on this line of thought? Is there a minimum set of computer software skills that you would recommend that people coming into our field have a working ability with?
Well, yes, probably. Things that allow people to rapid prototype and to illustrate their ideas. I think it's very important in many cases to be able to explain in a concrete way what it is you want. And some of the technology tools that we have enable you to do that a lot better than in paper and pencil. So I think I don't think there's any particular skill or program, but I think a general knowledge of things like HyperCard or Toolbook or FileMaker Pro or AuthorWare allow you to, at some level, express ideas that would be more difficult to express in other ways. Your degree of expertise with those, I think that's a personal thing. There are people who work with FileMaker 40 hours, 60 hours a week that will know things that I'll never know and probably don't want to. Same thing with AuthorWare and in any particular production package director. On the other hand, it's good to be able to throw together a little AuthorWare presentation if you want to.
What about applications like word processing, spreadsheets, page layout?
You can't know everything. Can't do everything. I think you have to pick and choose and optimize your time. You know what it is you need to do.
Yeah, in a general sense, what advice do you have for graduate students?
Try everything. Find out what you like and then do it. Some people are more suited to design. I said there are high-level people and detail people. I'd probably overgeneralize. I mean, there are people who do both, but some people like the routine of, say, task analysis and those kinds of things, job task analysis, and some people that just won't fit for. So I think you need to work. Well, another advice for graduate students would be to take as many different professors as you can. Don't take the same professor over and over and over, because after the first class, you pretty much know what that person's got to say. And different professors have different things to say. So I think I would expose myself broadly to a lot of different viewpoints and a lot of different ideas from different professors. And then once you decide what it is you want to do, take the personal interest in that to become the expert in it, for yourself. Because by the time you get out of here, in any particular thing, you'll know more about it than any of the professors in the program. If that's what you choose to do.
How important is it for students to be involved in professional organizations in our field?
I think it's very important. The first probably 8 or 10 years of your new career involve building networks. And those networks are people that you'll have a lifelong association with. So things like PDT and AECT and AERA are really your forums for building those networks. So I think it's very important that it also provides a forum for delivering papers, gaining visibility, extending your ideas. Your ideas are great in your head, but they're a lot better if they're out on paper somewhere, if people can read them and react to them. And professional organizations are where you do that.
As professionals, what can we do to improve education?
As professionals, what can you do to improve education? I think you have to answer that question.
Following up on on graduate students, describe if you have an opportunity to take a graduate student from day one that they walk into a program, describe your ideal graduate student. What types of things would they do over and above general?
They take a personal interest in some aspect of instructional design or instructional technology and start to become expert at that. They start to dig into that, read the literature, read everything they could know about it, discuss it, work that into their papers, into their ideas. They start writing. I think writing is very important. The ideal graduate student does a lot of writing. And we were talking about mentorship before, and I think a lot of graduate students in our program do this, so you kind of take it for granted. But helping and becoming a part of collegial, becoming part of the profession that you want to become a part of early in the graduate experience. So helping out with classes, either formally, as supervised teaching, or as informally as just volunteers, I think would be very beneficial. Now, whether that makes the ideal graduate student, I don't know, but probably the other thing might be collaborative writing. Getting involved in some collaborative writing projects. That's where I think it's as much for the professor as it is for the student. It gets you out of the box and helps you bring somebody else along and helps them come along too.
It looks like in our field we've made if you would comment on this statement, we've made an evolution from early in our field where we were interested in how people learn to now where we broaden that, and now we're interested in how people perform. Comment, have we lost our focus?
They aren't any
Have we broadened
different.
our focus?
They aren't any different. No, I think there's, before I made a little distinction between general education and performance, on-the-job performance. I think a learner's job, you know, if you think of a student's job, is to acquire new knowledge and to generate new ideas, just as much as a person on an assembly line's job is to assemble materials or provide services. So learning is a performance. And I think there are tools that can facilitate that. There are strategies to improve that. So if you think of it that way, it's a performance that's affected by incentives, just as performance on the job is affected by incentives. So there's a lot of parallels. It's just that the output of the task of learning is different from the output of a task of assembling widgets. But there is an output. So I think that overall it's a performance technology problem.
There's been a lot of debate in our field, not only here at Florida State, but all across the country, as to whether our programs should be housed in schools of education or should they be housed elsewhere. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes. I don't think it matters where they're housed. Same problems exist in any academic environment and home. There are limited resources, and faculty compete for limited resources. With regard to exposure to different ideas, that's available in any university. So, you know, people should probably take courses outside the College of Education. I'd encourage that. If they were in business, I'd encourage them to take courses outside the School of Business. If they were in communications, I'd encourage them to take, you know, other courses too.
What are your predictions for the future of instructional systems?
My predictions for the future of instructional systems. Well, right now, the one thing that I like about instructional systems is that it's so general, and if there's any constant, it is change. So instructional systems has to be adaptive, and it has to look at what the field needs and, you know, change itself to meet some of those needs. It has to be performance reactive in a way. One of the strengths of the field is that people come from so many different disciplines and different backgrounds. So you get new ideas entering the field all the time. And that's why I think you see some of the constructivism stuff coming back. There are people that were never associated with behavioral psychology coming in from disciplines like anthropology, sociology, and a number of other places. And they bring new perspectives and new ideas, new ways of doing things. What you have to be careful is that, you know, that's just one more point of view. There are many, many ways to do almost everything. But my prediction is that the field will remain very flexible, very changing. It'll meet the needs of the hiring community. You know, I think that we'll see. I should be very careful on saying this because the least flexible institution is probably education. We'll see more of our people going into public education than we have in the past. Especially into universities where you have things like mediated instruction, distance education. That's the next frontier. Probably a change in the paradigm for the certification of skills and knowledge, both in formal settings and in informal settings, like business and industry. And in any of these things, if you look at some of these trends that are happening, you can see a role for instructional technology people. May not be the same role that they had in the past, but there'll be a role. for anybody that can systematically look at a problem, come up with some alternative solutions, come up with a way of evaluating the impact or the effect of those solutions, and making revisions. And that's basically what a systems process is. So systems thinkers, systems process people are always going to be in demand, in my opinion.
You mentioned just a minute ago about, you were talking about constructivism, and that seems to be a hot new topic in our field today.
It's a philosophy.
Tell us what constructivism is, and does it have a place in instructional systems?
Sure, it's the antithesis of behaviorism. No, it's the idea that people construct knowledge and construct a reality from information and that they encounter. I think the notion of that it's anti-objective is wrong. Most constructivists I know are very sure of what they want to accomplish, and if they're sure of what they want to accomplish, then they have objectives. They just may not be able to explicate them because they haven't studied how to write them very well. No, it's a philosophy that is expressing itself in different forms or views of what effective learning environments will be, and that all can be tested.
In the book, Interactive Instruction and Feedback, you actually wrote a couple chapters in there, one having to do with program instruction, the other having to do with roles of questions and learning. How do you see these fitting into distance learning and with all the change in technology? How do you see the instructor's role?
I think the purpose of the chapter in that book on the role of questions was to say that questions serve many different purposes, and when we when we think of questions, a lot of people think of tests. A lot of people think of practice, but there used to be a dichotomy between didactic instructions and Socratic instruction. A Socratic instruction was basically inquiry-oriented instruction or question-oriented instruction, and didactic instruction was tell or receptionist learning. I think it's all part of a large continuum. You can use questions for anything, to arouse attention, to recall prerequisites, to get people into the content of a course, to provide practice, to assess performance. And it was just an exercise, an academic exercise basically, to look at different roles that questions can serve in learning environments.
And do those would apply to distance learning environments as well?
Oh, sure. Again, I don't see a whole lot of difference between distance learning and local learning, except the person is not sitting right in front of you. Same problems.
Talk a little bit about your experiences with Gagne.
My experience with Gagne. Well, meeting him the first time was quite a experience. He's a big man, if you've ever met him, physically big man, and his reputation and his academic experience is even bigger than that. So it's a very intimidating experience to meet him for the first time. But he's a very congenial person, and you very quickly learn that that he is very disarming. He'll get you talking about making clocks or something like that, something that he knows is away from talking about academics. We became quite close friends of the family and Gagne, and we would take trips over to New Orleans together in a car. And my wife and Pat Gagne would be talking about weaving or something, and Bob and I would be talking about learning theories or something, and it was quite an experience. But he is still, of course, he's still alive. He's still a very interesting person, and he's always receptive to listening to what you have to say. He may not agree with it, but he's receptive to listening. And but he has a short fuse and a short temper too sometimes, and almost no I thought it was very interesting that he and I got along so well together because he has no tolerance for mechanical things whatsoever. And of course, mechanical things are my forte. So every once in a while I would hear this, "God damn it," come from the other room when he would slam the phone down on the thing. "God damn thing." The phone wasn't working right. And anything that's not working right needs to get out of his way. So it was an interesting experience. He chose me to help him learn how to use a computer. And I remember going home and saying, this is probably the hardest thing that I'll ever have to do in my whole life, is get him to use a mouse. But he picked up on it quite well, and pretty soon we had him using the internet and everything.
You mentioned that earlier that you like to think on the more of a higher, not so much on the details, but more of the higher level. How does one get to a point where they can think about broader issues, broader perspectives, instead of having such tunnel vision?
Oh, I don't think it's a matter of broader vision or tunnel vision. I think it's both. When I say I like to deal with the high level kind of outlining and strategic issues and whatnot, and not so much with the details, doesn't mean the details don't have to be done, but you can hire graduate students to do that. No, there are some people that are very detail oriented, the Virgos that like everything put in their own little spot. If you go into my office, you'll see I'm not one of those people. But at the same time, you have to be very aware that that's where 90% of the time is in the 10% of the details that have to get done. The other 10% for the broader vision is something else. I think you need both, but some people are more oriented to one or the other. I don't think it's moving from one to the other.
How do you develop a sense of vision?
I think you have to look at the larger problem and say what really are you trying to accomplish here? One might look at the problem as we need instruction, or one might look at the problem as there's a performance deficit. If you start with design instruction, you're working at the details and might miss the forest for the trees. If you look at the performance deficit, you're looking at the broader issue, but you're not dealing necessarily with with the details of the solution to solve that performance deficit. So I think both types of people have to work together. I mean, there has to be somebody that says, well, is that really the solution? That is what you're doing really going to solve the problem? Or is the problem worth solving? Maybe it's not worth solving. Maybe the resources that are being put into solving that particular problem could be spent a better way, a different way, and then working around the problem, sort of.
What is the biggest problem that you see in our field today?
The biggest problem?
That we face?
I don't know. I haven't thought about it. You want me to, something off the top of my head? What's the biggest problem in our field today? Time, lack of time. My biggest problem is I've got too many ideas and not enough time to pursue them all. That's all.
Good. Knowing what you know now, what would you do differently given the opportunity to do that?
Absolutely nothing. No, I think it serves no purpose to go back into I'd become a physician. They have better unions. I don't know.
Why would a student who's starting a graduate career, why would they come to Florida State?
I think that there are two reasons. One, we have great students. And a student coming into the program, I mean, you're talking about coming into a residential program. And again, the strength of a residential program over a distance program is the camaraderie and the relationships you build in the program. You have access not only to the professors, but very close access to to other resources in the program. And so the students are a major strength of the program. The second, I think, are the diversity of the faculty. Not all the faculty have the same interest. They come from a variety of different backgrounds. And so you're not going to get the same story from all the faculty. They're, you know, and I think that broad level, and maybe, you know, at the expense of some detail in the technology side of things, is an asset.
We'd like to thank you for spending your time and
You're
sharing.
certainly welcome.
Sharing your insights with us and
Your stories.
your story.
Yeah,
We
well,
appreciate it.
thanks. I enjoyed it.
Okay.
How long did that take?
How long?
An hour?
An hour and 6 minutes.
How about
Hour
that?
and 6
Is that the shortest one so far? Great.
Actually,